Good afternoon and welcome to our conversation with our guest, Professor Dr. Raúl Santiago-Bartolomei. He's an assistant professor at the Grad School of Planning at the University of Puerto Rico-Río Piedras. So thank you all for being here, the ones that are watching online as well. So today we're just going to have a conversation about different topics. Obviously, the title here is post-hurricane housing. But before we begin, just want to give you the floor and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your professional trajectory, and who's Raúl Santiago?
Sure. Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Very happy to join everyone here, make the short leap over the Atlantic to reach this place right here. Um, Originally my background's in engineering, civil engineering. I started in a previous lifetime was a water resources engineer, working on flood control projects, drinking water infrastructure, and I hated it. Hated it with depth and with passion. But at the same time, that's the context in Puerto Rico. When I went to engineering school, it was all pharmaceuticals and construction companies, and that's kind of like the safest bet for a good paying job. Of course, when I graduated, that's when the economic system collapsed and there was no construction and no pharmaceuticals. So I went to water resources. But at that point, that's when I started realizing that I had interest in social problems writ large related to infrastructure and other topics, and that it wasn't a design approach that attracted to me to understand these problems. It was much more understanding the institutions, the political dynamics, the relationships of power. So it was kind of like to start in social sciences. So urban planning was kind of like the way to get into that. So I went to a planning school at UPR Rio Piedras, worked as a planning consultant for a few years, and did my PhD over at USC in LA, doing research on affordable housing and transit-oriented development in Southern California, and my dissertation on changes in property rights and economic reforms in Havana, how that coincided with the entrance of short-term rentals in Cuba. I had to do field work over there. Um, uh, during the time I was working my dissertation, that's when Hurricane Maria struck, Irma and Maria struck Puerto Rico. And then I started getting involved with the Center for a New Economy, which is a local think tank in the island that mostly delved in economic development issues, but now I had to get knee deep into reconstruction policy. And that's where I sort of applied the work I did on housing in Southern California and Cuba to gain new insights in the dynamics of Puerto Rico. And that's kind of been my research agenda since then.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So one of the things in, just to put sort of the contextual type of things, right? Where obviously the core of the conversation is going to be what's happened after Irma, Maria, and then the earthquakes and Fiona and the strike and all the good things, or all the things that happen in Puerto Rico, not necessarily good. But how was, pre-Maria, how was the housing in Puerto Rico? What were the housing issues just before we have this major event happening?
So we can go back a while. So when Christopher Columbus landed in Puerto Rico, I'm kidding, not that back. But I think we can start a little bit when the industrialization project started in the island, Operación Mano a la Obra, Operation Bootstrap. Was kind of also fertile ground for experimentation. So Puerto Rico has always been a site for colonial experimentations of all kinds. Housing is one of them. There are a few things that were tested there that had broader implications in the US and also in Latin America. Similar to Latin America, when the industrialization process started, there was also simultaneously a divestment on rural areas. So there was a lot of rural to urban migration. Now, different to the rest of Latin America. So that's when you had folks moving into makeshift homes in quote unquote informal settlements throughout urban areas. But different to Latin America, those places didn't grow to a scale that they did in most of Latin America, but because a lot of the folks that would have moved to many of these communities ended up in New York, in Chicago, in Hawaii, right? So the mass Puerto Rican migrations in those years. So these became kind of the sites for the new labor for these new urban jobs that started taking place. But at the same time, they were seen, many of these places were seen as dangerous health hazards. They were kind of living in hazard-prone areas, right? So the government used the same funds from the slum clearance program from HUD to renovate inner cities and use many of these same funds to forcibly relocate many of those households that lived in those settlements into public housing. And public housing became like a instrument of housing policy in a scale that only New York has matched. And that's why to this day, the second largest jurisdiction with the most public housing units is Puerto Rico after New York. For a while after that, they had development of the first inner ring suburbs at that time, because the idea is that now we have, part of the idea of having a new middle class, not only industrialization, they need to be homeowners. So a state-led effort to develop many of the first inner rings for the suburban areas, folks becoming homeowners for the first time. And I would say that more or less took off until the oil embargo in the 70s, because there was a huge recession in Puerto Rico and like elsewhere in the world. That proved, a site for new forms of experimentations on housing policy. One of the largest being housing co-ops, which already existed, but took a whole new level as a source of housing for a lot of the folks. And at the same time, when the federal government started divesting from public housing into project-based Section 8 and housing choice Section 8 vouchers, Puerto Rico transitioned into that as well. Now, what ended the recession in the 70s was a well-known documented policy called Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code. So Section 936 was a tax exemption program for manufacturing firms, U.S. manufacturing firms, if they were to relocate in Puerto Rico, manufacturing plants in Puerto Rico, wouldn't have to pay neither state nor federal taxes. So it was very general offering for many of these manufacturing firms. So it had a lot of pharmaceuticals and tech companies moving to the island. So it was the main motor of manufacturing development, that new stage of manufacturing development, right? To sort of restart that process. But one of the requirements for companies to be eligible for these tax exemptions was that they have to deposit their earnings in local banks. So that created an effect of providing new liquidity to banks that didn't have that before. And because of that, Puerto Rico eventually having a dozen banks or so grew to over 30 banks, and international banking became a site common in Puerto Rico because of those requirements. And they started lending that money a lot for new housing projects, for new development. So that's the origin of how housing became financialized, right? Because that's also the origin of secondary markets and securitization of many of these mortgages in finance. So you kind of have this well-oiled machine to build new housing for providing mortgages. And once the financial market was deregulated in the US, then you have now subprime mortgages in Puerto Rico as well. So that was kind of the source for a lot of the housing options for folks. And also the government started divesting even more than from subsidized rental housing, because they wanted to prioritize home ownership. At the same time, still criminalizing communities living in these quote-unquote informal settlements, right? So you have kind of like a three-tier situation where you have folks living in the informal settlements, folks living in the public housing and subsidized housing, unsubsidized renters, which is going to be the majority of renters, and the folks that became the new homeowners. And many of these developments increasingly further away from the jobs, right? Increasingly more peripheral areas. So which is very similar. It's basically a way to replicate the U.S. approach to urban development in Puerto Rico, but in a very in very short time period. Now, just to give you a sense, in the last 80 years, Puerto Rico has been gone from an island that was completely raised for sugarcane production. I mean, completely raised. There are no primary forests in Puerto Rico. They were all raised for sugarcane, to having luxury suburban communities, low-income suburban communities, large-scale public housing projects. That's a huge shift in landscape, right? In a very quick set of time. So what happened was that there was a precarity for renters that was never addressed. So Puerto Rico for many decades had a situation where over half of the renters, half of the cash paying renters, because we have a lot of non-cash paying renters that we still have to look more deeply into what the dynamics there. But among cash paying renters, over half of them since the 90s have been spending over a third of their income on rent. So that's a long-standing situation in Puerto Rico. That one's not new. Neither is the lack of sufficient subsidized housing, which is common throughout the U.S. Usually, in any given city, about one in every 4 eligible households receive some sort of a subsidy, either Section 8 or low-income housing tax credit or public housing. In Puerto Rico, is 1 in every 5. And at the same time, you have many of these households that then started buying this, becoming new homeowners in these increasingly further away areas. Now, that was kind of a situation until 2006. Now, in 2006, that's when the manufacturing tax exemption were completely removed. They were, in 1996, the Congress removed these tax exemptions, but they were phasing out until 2006. When 2006 hit, that's when the economic crisis in Puerto Rico started. And that's when the real estate bubble burst in Puerto Rico. So actually, the real estate and the financial crisis in Puerto Rico started before
the 2008.
The 2008 in the US. Of course, the financial crisis in the US didn't help. So the situation went from previous years, from 2000 and 2005, there were 15,000 housing units built every year in Puerto Rico. After 2006, it was less than 1,000.
Wow.
It's like a huge, drastic, a complete collapse of the construction industry and the housing industry. And of course, that meant that you have a little bit more renters. But at the same time, you had a lot of folks that left Puerto Rico during that time. That's when the population started declining. So you have a situation where prior to Maria, you had a lot of market price homes that no one was buying, and a lot of demand for subsidized housing, affordable housing that no one was supplying. So that was kind of that landscape before Maria.
No, and you mentioned, and even, in 2006, when this happens, if you look at the numbers, kind of like here in Florida, that's where you see the numbers of Puerto Ricans sort of start to grow in Florida and in Central Florida, and now we have kind of like 1.2 million Puerto Ricans here in the state, and sort of the emphasis of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at UCF. One of the things that you mentioned and about your research is, like the short-term rentals, particular Airbnbs. And there's been the discussion of, are those good, bad? What is the situation with Airbnbs in Puerto Rico? Are they meeting the demands or not? What is going on in that situation of those short-term rentals?
Sure. I think it's important to highlight why the short-term rental is such a central issue in Puerto Rico presently, as opposed to other larger cities in the US. So even though there was an increase in renters in Puerto Rico as a share of the population, not total number, because Puerto Rico's population is shrinking, but as a share, there was a larger share of renters going forward. In other cities, I think, pick 2, LA and New York, the 2 largest ones. They've been conflicts with Airbnb. Airbnb mainly because it's the largest platform of these short-term rentals by far. It has over 80% market share, so pretty dominant. They're trying new regulations to approach it. In LA and New York, when you look at the number of short-term rentals as a percentage of the total rental housing is about 3-5%, which is not insignificant, right? But there are municipalities in Puerto Rico when you have, it could be 20, 30%, 50%. It could be, in the case of municipality of Culebra, there are more short-term rental units than there are long-term rental units. So it's significantly more present, especially in coastal areas, right? And here's the situation, that why it's become such a mess in the island. It's not that the big cost, right? But it's definitely a feature that was not present before. So Puerto Rico, not even San Juan, has never had strong rental markets. So as I mentioned, renters are even more precarized than the renters in the US, right? So there's never been a lot of incentives to build rental housing. So you see, I mean, throughout the US, it's increasingly common. You have new buildings, and you have either corporate landlords or buildings that are all units are for leasing, right? That doesn't really exist in Puerto Rico. That doesn't really happen. So you have condo development is by far the most.
And those are for sale.
And those are for sale. So because rental markets are always historically weak because of purchasing power from renters, right? So what happened is that in 2012, trying a way to rehabilitate the real estate and also the economy of Puerto Rico, the government of Puerto Rico approved a set of tax exemptions codified in what was called Act 22 of 2012, which is targeted to all individual investors, wealthy investors, non-resident, to relocate to Puerto Rico. And they would basically pay 0% on capital gains, 0% on income tax. And there was, at first, there was some requirements for job creation. I think it was 5 jobs, which Francisco Catalá, a famous economist in Puerto Rico, was saying, 5 jobs, you can create it through any chinchorro in the corner. That's not, chinchorro is like a corner bar, informal corner bar. It's like, it's not exactly a high threshold to meet. But, and they eliminated that. That's not even a requirement now. So what happened is that even though some places starting to gentrify in the island because of investor activity before Maria, after Maria, because housing prices dropped so quickly for obvious reasons. So the island is devastated, so obviously there's no market of anything. A lot of investors took advantage of that situation and started buying up a lot of different properties, set them up as short-term rentals, because what short-term rentals do is that it expands the pool of possible renters far beyond the local market, right? It's basically, an international pool of tourists that could pay much more, and at the same time, you can make your return investment a lot quicker than you can in long-term rentals. So that's why it became such a hot business in Puerto Rico. And even after the pandemic, it became even worse. Even worse. So now, in 2014, you had around, I think it was like 2,000 or 1,000 short-term rental units that scaled up all the way to over 30,000 in 2020. I think last time it's about 25,000, which is about the same number that New York used to have before the present regulation. It's like 8 million people city.
So, one of the things, and thank you for that answer. So now you're kind of like getting a sense of, sort of the complex picture that is happening out there. You recently wrote an op-ed in El Nuevo Dia, which is the local newspaper in Puerto Rico, about some of the issues that you mentioned so far in terms of rentals and all sort of thing. But you want to expand a little bit, and you had some kind of like advice, some wise words out there in terms of possible not solutions, but recommendations of what we need to do.
Yeah, sure. So in that piece, I was basically highlighting some of the present issues that we already discussed, and also some of the why thinking in conventional terms was not going to solve it. Sorry.
Now, while you take a sip, just want to. So Vieques y Culebra is island municipalities within the island of Puerto Rico. And one of them was more famous because the Navy, well, both of them used to be Navy bombing ranges out here. And basically, what it became, it now is becoming a playground for tourists to come out here at the demise of the local population in terms of that. After Hurricane Maria, Vieques didn't have a hospital. I think that's been in the reconstruction out here. But you see kind of like, some of the results out here in terms of, the history of the U.S. military and Puerto Rico in that sense. So go ahead.
Sure. So basically, what I was saying in that piece is that because you have different dimensions, what you had before, you have a new form of housing financialization from the one you had in the 90s, not through mortgage securitization, but mostly institutional investor-led activity, and the presence of short-term rentals or platform-mediated speculation. So it means that you can't really think of it like a lot of folks were thinking about it. So part of the discussion, especially among the Home Builders Association, construction associations, and real estate association in the island, we're kind of saying we have to go back to the 90s and 2000s to solve this issue. And so it's like, of course, because that's their business model, and they know that's what they know, And it felt like not adequate to the scale of what the problem is. So they're basically thinking we have to get back to the 2000 where we used to build 15,000 units a year. And for me, it was, had to dispel some myths in that column. One of them is like, just increasing supply of housing at whatever price. It's not going to guarantee that prices are going to come down. Actually, in the 2000s, that's the period when they built the most. That's when the housing prices were the highest. So it depends on what you're building.
Mm-hmm.
What's the housing market that you're actually targeting, right? So developers are going to target the most profitable market, and it's not the affordable housing segment. So you have to think about how to have targeted policies towards increasing the affordable housing stock, considering the actual context of Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico, not even San Juan, is not a growing city like Orlando, New York, and LA that had basically hijacked the debate on housing, which is to push for more supply, which makes sense in those contexts. But in Puerto Rico, not really, because like I said, we shouldn't really have a housing crisis because population has been reducing for over 20 years. Housing units are not like oranges and apples that just expire and turn into compost. They're durable goods. So whatever we built in between 2000 and 2005 is still there, still building every year. And vacancy rates have been double digits since the 90s.
Wow.
So it's not really a supply-driven issue the same way it is in growing places, right? So what it indicates is you have a problem of the mechanisms for speculation on the existing stock, how it is acquired through large-scale investors, and at the same time, how it's mediated locally for local investors as well. So for me, you have to think a two-pronged approach to solve this issue. One is how to avoid displacement from the residents that are actually living in these high opportunity areas, in coastal areas, near jobs, et cetera. They don't have forced to leave their homes. So you need a set of policies geared to that. And you need another set of policies geared towards increasing the affordable housing stock. Now, the first one is kind of easier. Doesn't mean it's easy.
Of course.
Just easier.
Yeah.
Which is, strengthening tenant rights, strengthening the protections against eviction filings, rent control, which actually was a policy in Puerto Rico between 1946 and 1995 through the Ley de Alquileres Razonables. And other mechanisms such as community land trusts and housing co-ops to ensure, through a collective ownership or shared equity ownership of many of these properties, you can avoid folks from being displaced, especially vulnerable renters in high opportunity areas. And that's one set of policies. The other one is the hardest one. How do you increase the affordable housing stock? Now, that requires the government to overcome the idea that they just have to be facilitators. The government only has to facilitate. You just have to create the mechanisms for developers to solve this problem, because there's only so much developers can do. They can't really sacrifice profit margins just to make it more affordable. It's not going to make sense from a company perspective, and it's kind of unfair to expect them to do it as well. So they can't really solve that problem. So you need the government to be much more directly involved in providing the affordable housing units.
No, so that's, one of the things that you have mentioned before is sort of construction in Puerto Rico and, some of the challenges out there. I have, for the information, everybody, the General Accountability Office of the United States government just came out with a report about the progress made in the reconstruction of Puerto Rico, right? And basically, I'm just going to read the paragraph out there. You can find the report out there. Check us out on our Facebook page that is posted out there. But what they found was that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, had awarded $23.4 billion in public assistance to Puerto Rico's permanent recovery work related to Hurricanes Irma and Maria and the 1919 and 1920 earthquakes as of June 2023. Talking 23.4 billion. Of that, Puerto Rico has spent about 1.8 billion, 1.8 billion. And a substantial amount of permanent work remains. Further, about 11.3 billion of the awarded funds needs FEMA authorization before Puerto Rico can spend it. Puerto Rico subrecipients plan to submit project application and obtain FEMA's authorization to access and spend these remaining funds through 230 and possibly beyond, right? And the title is this: Progress Made, but the recovery continues to face challenges. So we're almost 7-8 years removed from these circumstances, right? And from what you've been telling, this is not a new problem per se in terms of that. So why is the recovery going so slow, and especially when these infrastructure projects and these reconstruction projects?
There are a few reasons. A few of them are highlighted in that report, right? So that's for public assistance, FEMA. That's for infrastructure projects, existing infrastructure units that have to be rebuilt and repaired. Now, at the time when this started, FEMA pressured the local government because it was so fiscally constrained. It's a way to forego the cost share, the state cost share for many of these projects. And this was an experiment, another experiment in Puerto Rico. They would, for the first time, use what is called Section 428 of the Stafford Act. So the Stafford Act is basically the federal law that establishes the whole framework on how a disaster is going to be managed, all the way from emergency management to all the way to long-term reconstruction, right? But so Section 428, what establishes that there's an alternative for public assistance in which there's no cost share for state government, but it requires or 0 to 10%, if I'm not mistaken, rather than 25 or 20. But it requires the government the local government to have fixed costs project, meaning that they have to get it right from the get-go. No change order, no anything. You better get it right, which feels like a fiscally responsible policy until you have things like, I don't know, inflation. And all of a sudden, what you budgeted, in 2018, given the pandemic and everything that happened, construction costs, increasing 20 to 30%, then that means it's not going to be feasible. Mm-hmm. But now you're constrained you have regulatory constraints into what you're going to do. So sort of FEMA set up its own trap. On top of that, you have labor shortages in construction, right? Now, here, it's when it gets a little bit strange, because the construction industry in Puerto Rico is lobbying heavily, advocating heavily to bring in migrant labor into Puerto Rico in construction, which wouldn't be the first time. Mm-hmm. A lot of the housing in the 90s and 2000s was built that way, a lot of Dominican migrants. And also the Tren Urbano.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you need visas to be approved to get those workers in. And the thing is, there's a limited set of visas for those workers. And Puerto Rico will have to compete against California, Texas, Florida, and Arizona. And I mean, I'm not a labor economist, but something tells me that Puerto Rico might be a less appealing place for many of these migrant workers to move rather than California, Texas, and Florida. And another thing is where you're going to house them. If you're having a housing crisis, where are you going to house these people? How are you going to solve that? So that's part of the problem. And the other thing that's sort of dissonant is that you have a labor shortage, but the labor participation rate is about around 40%, which is one of the lowest in the world. It's kind of like, but why are you asking for new labor when you're subutilizing your own labor force?
Yes, those are particular challenge. You mentioned the Tren Urbano, which is the urban train that they build in Puerto Rico that I think to this day is not financially sound yet. It's been a
Well, it's not a metro system. It's just one route.
Yeah.
And that's when the government, the collapse started.
Yes.
And they couldn't expand to the other routes for the metro system.
So you mentioned certain things in terms of, obviously Puerto Rico being a Commonwealth of the United States, they don't control their immigration statuses or anything like that. And like you mentioned, we have Puerto Rico has to compete with everybody else in terms of that. How much, and if you don't know, after in 2016, Puerto Rico beforehand had declared bankruptcy, and the federal government came in and established a fiscal and financial board that up to this day controls the finances of the island. Obviously, that was sort of for some people, they view it as very undemocratic in terms of that. It hampers a little bit of the government, but on the other side, the governments prior to did wildly physically mismanage the funds out here in terms of that. How much does the fiscal board have to do with all this that we're talking about today in terms of housing and legislation and put in sort of the resources to really tackle the problem?
A lot. I think that just to even highlight further, right? We're talking about colonial experimentation. The fiscal board is another one. And you have, written testimony from folks from Treasury at the time, like Antonio Weiss and other high level bureaucrats within Treasury, or kind of saying that we needed some model to address fiscal instability in states. So Puerto Rico was kind of a testing ground to this idea of having fiscal boards that already existed in cities, right? But they were liable to the governor. So in a way, you have some level of accountability to the folks living in those places, right? The Fiscal Control Board doesn't have anything like that. Its members are identified by the president and Congress, named by them. It's imposed. They have no accountability to the people of Puerto Rico, and that's been again and again validated by the Supreme Court, case after case. They have veto power over our government regarding budgets and decision making. When they first started, the first director, Natalia Yaresco, basically said, look, all we're doing here is telling you what the size of the room is, and you lay out the furniture in whatever way you want. When that happens, kind of saying, we're just going to tell you the constraints to fiscal policy, and you determine within those constraints how you're going to spend government money. But no, they've gone beyond that to basically tell us the brand of the furniture, material of the furniture, type of furniture. So even for economic development policies, which are not fiscal policy, they have a direct hand. One of them famously is the labor reform for have more flexible labor in Puerto Rico, eliminated a lot of the rights that workers already had in Puerto Rico, and that was done by the fiscal board. The privatization of the energy utility company was vetoed by superimposed by the fiscal board against the will of the government of Puerto Rico. The recent privatization of the ports was again superimposed by the fiscal board. And one of the things they've done is that as part of their fiscal plan, they focused their budget cuts in two main areas. One of them is higher education. So the University of Puerto Rico got its budget slashed by half in 1 year to another. And municipal governments. So municipal governments, the fiscal board established that they were cutting off completely fiscal transfer from the central government to municipal governments, even though they will have to still carry out the exact same tasks that were delegated by the central government. So in some municipalities like San Juan, that's about around 2-3% of their budget. In some municipalities like Vega Baja, it's 86% of their budget. So it's an 86% budget cut.
Yeah.
And so that means that since municipalities are the ones that are going to think creatively they're the ones that have to apply eminent domain to acquire condemned buildings, public nuisance buildings. It might be converted to housing. They're the ones that are going to have to apply for funding to do infill development. They're not going to have the capacity to do it. They're not going to have the capacity to have well-organized systems to monitor short-term rentals. So it has a direct effect over those things. And also, the board has even established some key parameters into how they have to implement property taxation.
Yeah, so that obviously brings about some complications in terms of that. Usually one of the questions, right, and that we always have, right, especially the ones that we are here, is what is your vision of what can we do to help, if there's anything that we can do to help?
From the state side?
Yeah.
Well, I think that there are key lessons from the Puerto Rican diaspora that have accumulated for decades that can inform policies going forward and leapfrog many of the field tested projects that I already have regarding how to develop new affordable housing units. I'm looking at Jimmy here, the audience would provide testimony to that. How they can actually scale up to policy is an important lesson. I think also still making the case of Puerto Rico visible for decision makers over a disease is very important. But especially the first one, I would say that tend to meet. I mean, we know there's a lot of circular migration within the Puerto Rican diaspora, and we have to do, part of what this center here does so well is try to document and highlight what are the dynamics to that, right? And usually, in migration studies, folks focus on monetary remittances, but they also need the social remittances, the cultural remittances. That's how lessons are transferred. That's how people learn. That's how new crafts are transferred from folks to other folks at the same time. Even money and financial aid could become, resourceful new modes of field testing new approaches to increase the affordable housing stock, and not even for building housing, also the political strategies to learn how to advocate towards, for the policies that are actually needed. When this present crisis started, no one spoke about gentrification in Puerto Rico. That wasn't a term that was really used. But it is now, and part of that, I think it has to do with the experience from the Puerto Rican diaspora elsewhere. We're saying, oh, no, we've seen this happen before. We know what this is.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, a lot of the issues that you mentioned that are happening in Puerto Rico have happened in other places throughout the United States and Europe and the world in terms of that. So there's lessons to be learned as well. So with that, I'm going to open the floor. I don't know if we have any questions from our online folks out there, but I'll open the floor to any questions out here for the audience. If you have any, don't be shy. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you explain the state of subsidized housing versus the installments and there's a lot of vacant?
So you mean numeric terms?
Not numeric, but just the state of
Sure. So the question is, how does the state of the vacant housing compare to the subsidized housing in Puerto Rico? So I would say that, I mean, you have a lot of public nuisance properties. Now, the best estimates here come from the census, right? So the census doesn't include public nuisance properties because those are not habitable units. So even using their own measure, those vacancy rates that I mentioned are not including public nuisance, those double digits. That means those are habitable units. In some places in the island, they reach over 25, it reaches over 25%. In other places, it's around 8, 9, 10%. And that's excluding, second homes and vacation homes, right? From those estimates. So if it's about 1.5, 1.2 million, 1.5 million units, say 20%, it's about, that means we have 300,000 vacant properties throughout Puerto Rico. Now, in terms of the total subsidized housing stock, I imagine it's about 150,000. Now, the waiting lists are really long for public housing and Section 8. For public housing, last I saw was about 15,000 people. So Section 8 is about 10,000. And actually, those lists are closed off. They're not admitting new entrants. So that means that the need and demand for those subsidized units is even larger. There are a few upcoming low-income housing tax credit projects. But of course, the way eligibility determinants work for those, that means it tends to have a little bit higher income households living in those units compared to public housing and Section 8. So I don't like to delve too much in forecasting because it's a.
And the question was that, what are the forecasts for
Yeah.
Puerto Rico 5, 10,
5,
15
10
years down the line?
Thank you, Fernando.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of a little bit unscientific game. But to your question, I would say you can have different scenarios, right? Because the thing that makes it so hard to forecast that is like it depends on the decisions we make in the present. Now, if things stay the course, even just staying as they are, no, the population is going to be decreasing even faster. So somewhat contradictory. The fiscal board presents a somewhat rosier picture of the economy of Puerto Rico because they have to. They just restructured the debt with creditors that they can't enter a debt restructuring agreement to repay the debt, saying that we're going to be worse off in the future, because then creditors wouldn't accept that repayment plan, of course. But even in that rosier picture, what they were saying that we're going to have economic growth 1% around for a few years, it's going to drop down again once reconstruction funding ends.
And even, if you look at the makeup of the population as well, Puerto Rico is increasingly becoming an elder place as well. And that's not only Puerto Rico. Obviously, we have that going on in a lot of places because of the decisions that we have made in terms of policies, jobs, all those.
It's heading towards an inverted population pyramid. Yeah.
But that's yet another challenge for Puerto Rico in terms of the economic projections, right? If you're going to have more elderly folks that require more chronic health type of care, and then less young people, the math simply doesn't add up out here. But again, that's, we never know. I mean, one of the things that we have to know about Puerto Rico, nobody, even with the reconstruction, nobody expected that we were going to have a global pandemic. that was going to increase the cost of everything, and we're still recovering from that. And that was just 2 months after the earthquakes that have not been experienced out there, although Puerto Rico sits on a very active fault out there. So that's another issue and consideration out there. So there's certain things that, that's why it makes it so difficult to forecast, because you can have this phenomena that the best estimates and models could not account for. But to your question, and for the ones viewing online, just recently there's a study that Puerto Rico 100 basically came out, and they lay out kind of like a set of plans of how to make renewable energy, and sort of rebuild the grid out there by 2050 or so. And they have different scenarios. So those exercises are taking place. And it's good to have plans. Obviously, from a planner, it's always good to have plans. But I remember you saying in a conference, right, that Puerto Rico has plenty of plans, right? Or before the hurricane, right, we had plenty of plans and no money.
Yeah.
And now we have a lot of money and no plans on how to sort of go through the situation.
Well, there's a temptation in post-disaster context to treat it as a blank slate. And the idea is that no, there's been planning efforts previously have documented the needs of folks on the ground. And the way to push forward reconstruction more hastened manner is to start by what's been planned already, rather than trying to redo everything from scratch.
Yes, submitted a question, and they want to know if Puerto Rico were to pass a law offering concession possession, would that allow people to qualify for federal recovery grants?
A law for concession possession. I'm unsure about that.
So in,
Repeat the question.
they want to know that if Puerto Rico were to pass a law where they would offer concession possession instead of giving the land for free, would that then allow people to qualify for federal recovery grants?
I think that means about the real. I don't know if the question is heading this direction, but one of the issues for folks to be eligible for recovery money, it's a long-standing problem in the federal framework, is that eligibility is tied to property ownership, right? So, which kind of means that personhood is tied to property ownership. It means that the recovery, the federal recovery, it's more, rather than addressing social vulnerability, it addresses property ownership. So it means that folks that have unknown tenure status are likely not going to be eligible for federal money.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so you mentioned the low labor participation rate in Puerto Rico, and I was curious, to what extent has that been affected by the housing crisis? Is that sort of a result of the crisis, or the other way around, maybe?
So the question is, low labor participation, the housing crisis, is it the housing crisis that is leading to low labor participation, is the other way around, and what is the interplay between the two?
I think it's mostly that they had a collapsed construction sector since 2006. That's kind of like, I would say that's the main cause. It's just that the housing crisis makes it even more difficult to house potential workers going forward.
Thank you for being here. What is the number of vacancy includes places like Roosevelt Road that have like buildings of hotels and the housing for the Marines that used to live there, etc. And the other question is about the elderly. So how many of those that are looking for housing are old people? And if you have any estimation of people that are willing to go back to Puerto Rico if they get housing. if they have an opportunity to buy a house or to move to an affordable house, if they're willing to go back to Puerto Rico.
And the question is about vacancies, the elderly, where their house, and if affordable housing was provided, would that be an incentive for people to return to Puerto Rico?
Yeah. So I would say the first part of the question had to do with vacancy in places like Roosevelt Roads, a former military base abandoned by the Army or the Navy. So I'm not sure if the census is counting those units, to be honest. I don't think so, because it's not really, they're not really housing units. They could be turned into housing units, possibly, but I really doubt it that they're counting it, because it's really military installations. And there's very little being used right now other in the airport and the ferry to Vieques and Culebra. But it could be a source of affordable housing, especially in that eastern part, especially for potential essential service labor that might be headed to Vieques and Culebra, where they are so needed, right? So that could be an option. Right now, the government has always thought of some sort of resort setting for high-end luxury apartment hotels, and for not for unsurprising reasons, they can't ever find the finance to make that happen. It's not really feasible in that place. But anyway, so that's a part of the question. In terms of, I won't say not to think about the elderly folks actively seeking housing, but we can get a sense of how precarious is the situation for the elderly, right? So when you look actually the profile of the people that are occupying public housing and Section 8 is overwhelmingly older households. Also, a lot of to be older women that tend to be occupying those places. So that's kind of like the phase of the poverty situation living in those units. At the same time, as I mentioned, half of renters spend over a third of their income. When you break that in rent, when you break that down by age, folks over 65, that share jumps all the way to almost 70%. Because folks are living paycheck to check from Social Security mostly. And we know that Social Security payments in Puerto Rico is lower than the rest of the US. So what else? I would say that that gives you a height, because as older households have a greater chance and a likelihood of becoming renters once again, even if they own homes, tend to consume the wealth of their home somewhat earlier, and then to return to, I mean, not overwhelmingly, but a lot of them do. And I think the other thing is the geographic distribution, right? So many of these older households are not in high opportunity areas near the services they need. Many of them concentrated in remote rural areas throughout Puerto Rico, where it's hard to reach through ambulances, hard to reach, and not really feasible for them to drive to get medical care or caregiving services they need. So it's kind of had to work in tandem, right? There have been some creative approaches. So one of them is the municipality of Coamo. So the municipality of Coamo in the south of Puerto Rico has strategically lined up the federal funding for housing, like home and low-income housing tax credit in Section 202, to prioritize housing for the elderly in the municipal center. Sorry. As a way to prioritize access to services. Yeah. It's getting used to the colder weather. And your last question on how to make it attractive for the diaspora to return. Yeah. Housing is the, thank you. housing is be the easiest way to do it. That's the largest expenditure per household. Over most of your income is gonna go to housing. So that makes it much more safer and likelier to have folks to return in Puerto Rico. If you tie it to, folks that might be willing to return and invest and spend in the island.
I think, one of the problems that you mentioned before is that the municipalities lost a lot of money from the control board. One that people will have, if some of you have family that moved here 12 years ago, and the house have been abandoned in Bayamón. There's a lot of people from Bayamón here in Florida. My hometown, that's now.
Debatable.
But they had, probably that house that we left, have a debt of $25,000 to the green, which is the agency that collect tax on houses. So if I look back, I look to Puerto Rico, and I see that creepy house have already $25,000 in debt, and I have to invest another $20,000 to get the house ready to move in. That's $45,000 right there. So it's not gonna be, people are not gonna look into that as a possibility. Actually, I was talking to Laudi that wants to buy a house in Morovis, and she cannot find a house in Morovis to buy. That is a good looking offer to have an investment.
There's no one size solution to this. So let me recap the
Oh,
comment.
yeah, so basically the comment/question is about houses that are left behind when people move. And then, we have municipal taxes that accumulate. And if people want to return to that property, they're going to find that they have some type of tax responsibility, and then the money to spend to upgrade the house, that obviously is not a very attractive financial situation for people to go back to, that house that they are left behind.
Yeah. So I would say a few things. So the property tax collection agency, Karim mentioned. I mean, the reason that tax accumulates is because that house is no longer the primary residence. Because it's no longer the primary residence, it's going to be taxed at a higher rate. If it were used as a primary residence, most of them are going to be exempt from paying property taxes if it's used as the primary residence. So that's kind of the reason why it tends to accumulate the debt. If you have folks that moved away, it means that it's not their primary residence anymore. So that's why it creeps up. I think that, and even then, it's not taxed at such a high rate as, say, Florida or Texas, which is the property taxes are much more expensive. Partly because there's no income tax. But I would say that in those cases, I mean, there are ways to create repayment plans to, if you're willing to invest in return to your home as your primary residence. If not, that's easily created through policy. It's not a hard solution to come up with, right? But it has to happen. It doesn't exist right now because the CRIM just wants to basically acquire that debt some one way or another. But at the same time, I kind of feel that if you have properties that were abandoned for a few years and no one's taking claim of them for a while, and it's increasingly becoming a public nuisance, I think municipalities should have the tools to reacquire those units and reuse them for housing for the folks that are living there. But if you have folks that are willing to come back, right, you could prioritize housing units for those that are willing to return to be used as their primary residence, which again is going to be much more likely to be exempt from paying property taxes. Now, on your example on Laudi's purchase of Morovis, I'm kind of thinking, why Morovis? Do you want to retire in Morovis? So Morovis is a rural area in in Puerto Rico. So it kind of tells me like you're really looking for a retirement setting, which is fine because a lot of people are actually returning to Puerto Rico from diaspora to retire, right? In the island, of course, in places that are rural, idyllic settings, but also far away from caregivers and essential services they're likely going to need in their retirement years. But I think that would have to be different than, say, folks that are within labor age that want to return and be more entrepreneurial and invest in new possibilities in the island. Anyway, I think Sarah said they had.
I just have a question about what was asked from who's online. I'm not sure if the question was connected to the fact that it's not about, indeed, as you said, the fact that the land is concessions or it's given for free, but it's just like that the regulations, as you mentioned, that allow for people to apply for individual assistance are set by FEMA, and whoever is in Puerto Rico can access federal funds. The problem is that there's a lot of generational housing in Puerto Rico, which is what prevents people not to not own the land or have it for free, but prove that whether their grandfather or even before was the owner of that land and just provided this land and house to the future generation. So it's just a matter of matching the names who is currently using that family-wise and who is on the papers. That's a problem that is being debated a lot within the FEMA region too, and it's actually what is trying to be changed to kind of accommodate for these kind of situations. So it's not that anybody got the land for free or things like that. So I don't think that's the problem. It's more how federal regulations kind of take for granted that things work in Puerto Rico or in territories in general, like in the continent USA. So probably that kind of provides a little bit a follow-up to that.
So to recap for recording purposes, what Sarah is explaining that there's besides informal tenure status, a lot of folks have hard time proving ownership because of succession rules in Puerto Rico. It's a Spanish civil code. So it means that successions are kind of established in a different way than common law in the US. And it becomes a murkier affair to identify who actually is going to be the actual owner who's going to respond to this, especially it's been many generations and have folks that haven't responded for taking care of the land. You have extended family occupying those places, and they can really claim. And a lot of the ownership papers are not digitalized, and they're getting a lot further since, but still long ways to go. I would say that one of the issues there also is that FEMA is not even complying with its own guidelines, because to access, in this case, individual assistance for housing repair, FEMA's own guidelines establish that it defines ownership as when an occupant spends the largest share of repair and maintenance costs. So it's not tied to a deed, right? In that definition, and it establishes a series of ways to prove that happens. It could be a deed, that would be the fastest way to do it, or it could be a water bill or electricity bill. It's in your name. But the thing is that FEMA, when they roll out the programs on the field, they don't follow their own guidelines. And they just require the deed. When folks don't have that in hand during an emergency, then they're basically shut off from accessing recovery money in that aspect. So it's kind of addressing the succession aspect and also FEMA following up on its own regulation.
Deviating a little bit from the topic of housing, still related, also mentioned the field of focus for you and your studies. Infrastructure in Puerto Rico, what are some recent projects and ongoing projects that are projected to hopefully shift things a bit in the again, it's the housing, the issues evolve and change. But yeah, what are some projects that are being worked on right now?
So in addition to housing, are there any infrastructure projects that are taking place right now that you can speak of?
Yes. There's a few of them doesn't get me really excited. that had to, related to highway extensions that have been in papers for 30, 40 years. PR 22, PR 10. It's going to connect south to north, and extension of PR 22, which is going to extend the highway all the way to the west side. And there's a whole literature in the transportation folks on, how wise it is to expand highways to alleviate traffic, and how that actually leads to induced demand and things that what ends up happening is actually exacerbates traffic. But those are some of the most important ones. I think other ones had to do with how they're going to spend a lot of the money on residential solar panels. That's not I mean, individually, and none of those are large scale projects, but they in aggregate. Now, one of the issues I have with that is that, as we were discussing yesterday, it's kind of like the privatized resilience approach. It means that individualizing the possibilities of having more reducing your vulnerability to disasters in the future, right? But anyway, it's a huge expense in that area. I think the other one has to do with they're discussing, and there's not funding tied to that yet. It has to do with the expansion of the routes for the metro rail in San Juan. So that's kind of like in the talks. I think the other ones had to do mostly with public-private partnerships for existing infrastructure, and that includes the ports and some of the other airports. Some money for repair and rebuilding and retrofitting a little bit, but nothing really, I would say, substantial in ways that would actually have a much more multiplying effect.
What are some of the criteria that you more so have seen that are like performance measures for some of these projects, or projects that you would like to do that you've seen that PR has already done like plans for? And I remember you also talked about how the municipality that's trying to kind of have more of their elderly population come in. That reminded me of like the blue zones kind of approach to like farming. That and what other strategies do you think in urban design as well do you think would help with this, with a lot of the crises that are going on?
Yeah, I think that the metrics have to be directly tied to how you identify or target the population that you want to serve, right? So if you want to serve impoverished households, poverty rate has to be kind of one of those measures, right? Or impoverished households in terms of their expenditure in relation to housing, or some of the other measures, right? If you're actually trying to address housing affordability, writ large, how median rents are changing in these places, right? How are median home prices changing in these places? If you're trying to address affordability. I mean, others, if it's energy infrastructure, for example, you definitely and they already have metrics for that. The frequency when you have blackouts and energy interruptions is one key measure. I think one that we have to get better, and that's just the reliability of the system. It's not addressing the affordability of the system, right? So energy in Puerto Rico is among the most expensive in all of the US. I think only Hawaii and the Virgin Islands, also islands, are more expensive. But also median income in Hawaii and Virgin Islands is substantially larger than Puerto Rico. So housing is a huge expense, especially if we're going to be facing heat waves in the future and this kind of events. So one of them one key measure has to be how much are folks spending as a share of their income on energy and utilities, right? I mean, that's again, for the rule of thumb for me is the metrics have to be tied to the population that you're targeting. It can't be just administrative metrics, like how much of the funding are you using? How many households are you serving? Which is kind of what local agencies have set up as metrics, and at the same time is what the federal agencies are requiring of them as performance measures. Like, how fast are you spending that money? How many households are using that money? Not in terms of impact, which is, I guess, what your question is related to.
So with the elderly population, you know of any plans of, how do we build houses that are gonna meet the need of an elderly population, right? Because I think a lot of the development is like this brand new flashy apartments and all sort of stuff, but the reality, as the population grows older, you have a lot of homes that are not really capable of meeting the needs of the residents.
Yeah. So it's no easy answer. Because I think for the elderly, it's housing tied to transportation, tied to medical care. Medical care has collapsed in Puerto Rico, like completely. And I think a huge chunk of the blame goes to insurance companies, have made it unbearable for medical staff to stay in the island. They have specialists living by the numbers, relocating throughout the U.S., leaving the island. So you have situations where you have folks getting appointments for medical care many months down the road from when they actually need it. So that's like a common sight, right? That's one problem we have to address. But let's say it's solved magically somehow. In terms of how you deal with housing, a few things. Housing near the urban centers would be the best approach, tied to an actual public transportation system that can move these people around, because then we don't want to make it overly dependent on cars, right? So we have to invest in public transportation systems across the different municipalities. And some municipalities are being able to do that, not only in urban centers, but also recognizing that many of these elderly households don't really want to leave their rural settings, like Morovis. But some municipalities have been very creative in establishing new public transportation routes in these rural areas to connect to the urban centers. And it's completely municipally financed. So Carolina has been able to do it. Mayagüez has been able to do it. Ponce has been able to do it. Quebradillas has been able to do it. Camuy as well. Atillo. Trujillo Alto is going to have a new system for them as well. So this is replicable, right? So I think that's kind of have to think if it's not only in terms of the housing, and usually that's decision making in many of these places is so fragmented that you don't really have housing folks talking to transportation folks who are not really talking to the caregiver staff. But you kind of have to work those in tandem because they're all units of social reproduction policy, right?
Yeah, and I was thinking even along the lines of retrofitting houses, right? Like wheelchair ramps, holders when you take a shower, all those type of things, because that's really becomes a challenge. And we saw that.
We have to rehabilitate the sidewalks in Puerto Rico.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, especially because that was a lot of the in terms of the recovery and even the mitigation and preparation for disasters. You have folks that, they're, unfortunately, Puerto Ricans have a high level of disability and mobility and all those type of things. So that makes it also a big challenge in terms of that. And we saw that, when rescuers were going out there, they found elderly folks in their home because they have no way to move.
Well, most of the deaths related to the hurricane, most of them were elderly households.
So that becomes also kind of like to your idea of the matrix to what you really want to accomplish, right? In terms of kind of like these reports of, hey, how much have you spent?
Exactly.
In terms of that. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I don't know if we have any from the.
I've definitely learned from this conversation. There's been quite a bit of success, it seems, in the decentralization, allowing municipalities to make decisions to tackle these issues on their own, I suppose. Do you foresee that model as continuing down the line, given its success, perhaps relative to island-wide solutions?
Yeah.
Or do you think that'll be
So I would say let me not romanticize the municipalities too much because there are also plenty of case studies of air disasters right there. But I would say that think of municipalities as spaces you have a little bit of wiggle room to experiment. policy-wise, right? And see how those lessons are transferred. And things, one of the common things in policy analysis is that we're very good at analyzing what doesn't work, but everyone is an expert at what doesn't work. Now, finding what does work, especially in precarious bureaucratic settings, is a hard endeavor. It's really hard, but you can find them and see what is going to be the lessons transferable to other places. So one example I like to highlight, one of the biggest fiscally constrained municipalities, Villalba in the south. During the pandemic, that was a municipality that was able to set up their locally grown contact tracing system for COVID cases, when not even the Central Department of Health could do it. They did it in that rural, remote municipality, and surrounding mayors said, I want to do that too. You know, how do you do it? We hired a local epidemiologist, and I want an epidemiologist too. I want to hire them here. We want to set up the exact same system. How do you do it? And they started replicating that, and that actually became the model for it became the central contact tracing system for the Department of Health. So we have precedents here on how do we actually, but again, you know, making sure that not the lessons from Villalba are not going to be directly transferable to a larger city like San Juan. You know, it's going to be a lot easier where word of mouth has a much more useful tool in a place like Villalba. In San Juan would be the worst way to approach that. But it kind of sends you the idea that it can be done. It can be done in these settings. And the truth is that most municipalities look like Villalba and less like San Juan.
You know, and I think you bring a good point of the COVID response in Puerto Rico that, you know, we've talked about all the challenges, but I think one of the success stories was how Puerto Rico was able to manage the COVID-19 pandemic, few deaths, you know, high degree of vaccination, you know, a lot of surveillance on the scene, you know, so that worked. And I think in Puerto Rico, from some municipalities, you know, they have to be part of that policy making because these are probably the people that are more close to the population. Right, the motto in Puerto Rico is that your mayor knows what's going on in the community. That's probably in most towns that's the biggest point out here. But you're right.
And it's usually the only government that
Exactly.
they know, that the only government they're exposed to is the municipal governments.
So I mean, there's, you know, and there's been discussion of, you know, downsizing municipalities because there's overlap of services, all those type of things. But at the same time, you know, that could be a model because that's probably the people that are more in tune of what you can do out there. So it could be a model that could be replicated in some areas. And maybe perhaps we need to think a little bit different in more of the larger urban areas that are a little bit different out there with that, yeah.
So one person commented and said that in Utah, ski resorts are basically built on federal land. So the resort is private, but the land is federal. And that helps the resort. So whenever they are in need of some kind of post-disaster recovery, they qualify for federal grants. So they were wanting to know if something like that could be implemented in Puerto Rico on a larger scale.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. At least in the emergency disasters, in the emergency management stage, immediately after, I mean, you need places to shelter folks. Federal land is kind of like a no-brainer. I mean, I wouldn't have an issue with El Morro be full of,
Yeah,
you know,
tents or
shelter. I mean, if the need be. I mean, but the other obvious ones, I mean, even in California, I think there's I'm pretty sure that in emergency settings, I think hotels have to provide accommodation for disaster displaced households. So
I think their point as well is that what if that were the case with homes? So the home would be private, it would belong to the family, but the land that the home is built on would be federal. So that we post-disaster, like another Maria, they could qualify for funding to help rebuild their home. So that's the first part. The second part that I would ask to that is, would people be okay with it knowing that the land was not theirs?
we already have something similar. So for example, I think there are still issues with how FEMA addresses that. So for example, one of the households that tend to fall in the cracks of FEMA are mobile homes, which is kind of like, yeah, you own the structure, you don't own the land, and that sets up an issue, short circuits FEMA's process on how to determine eligibility. It shouldn't be complicated, but it does. It is. But we have one success story for the Caño Martín Peña communities, which are low-lying neighborhoods in the center of San Juan near mangroves, where thank you, where they have a land trust set up there. And the community land trust is the actual owner of the land, and people just have surface rights to their homes. So it's collectively owned land. Well, you have some rights to the structure you're occupying. Now, folks were fine with that. And actually, compared to households that didn't have secure tenure, they were able to access FEMA funding for repairs through the community land trusts. Likewise for the co-ops, multifamily co-ops. So the co-op is going to be the owner of the land and the owner of the building, but each individual household can claim surface rights. So they can document their damages, and then the co-op is the one that's going to apply and determine eligibility for funding through FEMA.
We have one more question.
So what is the relationship, if you can describe, of the HUD administration and the government of Puerto Rico / Junta?
HUD, well, I can tell you that HUD has been very willing to approve pretty much anything that the government of Puerto Rico wants. That includes using disaster funds as a loan for a hotel developer and the expansion of the highway system, neither of which really meets their own guidelines, and has been very willing to accommodate a lot of the demand from the developers. So they're sort of really haven't been very effective in, I guess, establishing the actual, enforcing the guardrails that they set up for her to spend the money. Now, La Junta is a different question. No one messes with the Junta. I think because the Junta is really a congressional creature, but Congress is not really a fixed bureaucratic structure. So it makes it hard for the Junta to be held accountable. So in reality, FEMA and HUD don't have to interact with the Junta at all for anything. It's just through the sub-awardees, which would be the local government agencies, Department of Housing, and the Central Office of Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resilience.
Well, thank you so much for this great conversation and a lot of new knowledge, questions, and lessons learned and lessons to be learned. So thank you so much for being with us here today. And thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.